Hi, I'm Frances Yang from Arup in San Francisco, and I'm here to give you a quick run-through of an Environmental Product Declaration, an EPD. Now, I'm assuming you know an EPD is generated through an LCA, or Life Cycle Assessment, through a PCR, a Product Category Rule. So I'm going to focus on the reports themselves with my lens as a designer and specifier of materials and structures in the built environment. Now, there are way more features in an EPD that can be covered in just a few minutes, so I'm going to just go over the very key things I would want my colleagues to know if they were to look at an EPD for the first time. The first thing to note is that EPDs can look very different from one another. Here I have 6, ranging from 8 pages covering just one product to 45 pages covering thousands of products, and only 2 look similar. It's because the only thing that must be consistent is a certain level of quality and transparency of content per the ISO standards that govern EPDs. The appearance is totally up to the manufacturer and often defaults to the company hired to oversee production of the EPD, also known as the program operator. So just because 2 EPDs look the same doesn't mean the environmental impacts can be compared, because they could be covering products that are not comparable. So how do you look into that? The first thing to look for is the product description. Some of these use illustrations, and some just use words. You should look for whether they state the functional unit or the declared unit, because the 2 are very rarely comparable. For example, the EPD for Western Red Cedar is for 1,000 board feet of green lumber, while the similar looking one for 1 cubic meter of cross-laminated timber. And it's unlikely these offer the same functional performance. And in all cases, make sure what is described matches what you're interested in. Here it is critical to check if there are additional materials that would need to be added to complete the product you have in mind, and would thus have to add to the environmental impacts quantified in the EPD. Next is to find out what life cycle stages were included. Here they show cradle to grave. Oftentimes it'll cut off at cradle to gate. If it's to grave, what are the assumptions for maintenance, use, and end-of-life phases? Do they sound reasonable? Sometimes this is described as the scope of the LCA, or conveyed through the system boundary description. You might find it as a diagram, which can help you identify what is excluded. Ask yourself if there are additional manufacturing and transportation stages that appear to be missing, and particularly for bio-based products. You want to look for comments on end-of-life and carbon sequestration that may not be included in the system boundary of the EPD. But there could be some informative text that speaks to these. Next, you'll want to read about the data quality, which not all EPDs will contain. With some, you have to go back to the LCA report, but in the least, they should talk about the geographical scope, sometimes as a map, so you can assess if there is potential variation due to regional differences, or if there are gaps that have to be filled with data from other regions. You see that in this concrete EPD, they had to fill in gaps from outside the US. Now we come to the impacts, the numbers that are what most people attain an EPD for. The first question you may have here is, what do these mean? Some EPDs will have a section offering some explanation. If not, there are some good resources, such as this book, Life Cycle Assessment by Professor Kate Simonen. Back to the EPD, for the US products, you'll see usually TRACY or CML as a characterization method, both of which are widely accepted in the US and will most likely meet what is prescribed if you're using the EPD to meet requirements of a green building code or rating system. But do remember that results from different characterization methods should not be compared to one another. So if EPDs can really be compared, what is the value in them? Well, here is where it can be useful to discover in which life cycle stage or stages, the majority of impacts occur and what they originate from. If the EPD covers a range of products, we can also learn what variations lead to higher impacts, which can motivate us to select ones with less impact, if all else is equal. Or we can start evaluating trade-offs towards selections that are overall more desirable to the project team. And in the least, we can better understand the impact of activities up the supply chain and even start a dialogue with manufacturers in order to realize which choices lead to more significant improvements. Nearly last, but not at all least, you should check for stated limitations. There should be language in the additional information sections on environmental and human health impacts not captured or quantified in the EPD. Because there are things that LCA methods are very poor at quantifying right now. Oftentimes, this will include hazardous materials, especially in the use stage, or it could include information on raw material sourcing practices. However, just because some things are listed in these sections does not mean all aspects have been addressed. Here is some standardized language that describes upfront the overall limitations of the EPD. Disclosures like this, especially embedded within EPDs, is something in which we can encourage across all EPDs because consistency and transparency will aid more comprehensive understanding and use of these resources. Finally, the last thing to check quickly is validity. Usually, near the front, you'll find a table that attests to the legitimacy of the EPD. It should state who sponsored the EPD, most usually the manufacturer, but sometimes it's an industry, who is the program operator, who conducted the LCA, and that it's been verified by a third party. Also that the PCR was produced per ISO 14025. Here you should check that the PCR it follows seems appropriate for the product that the EPD claims to cover. Also, if you're trying to compare impacts between EPDs, you really need to check they are based on the same PCR, plus the many other comparability checks I mentioned. Lastly, check the EPD is within the dates of its validity. And actually, this part of the EPD can be useful for knowing who to ask if you have more questions about the EPD and background, PCR, or LCA. So do keep in mind that there are plenty of people to help designers and specifiers properly understand and interpret these relatively new resources. I hope this has been a helpful start.